The train pulled away with a long, lonesome wail that hung in the snow-choked air like a ghost refusing to be buried. It was a sound of finality, of doors closing and worlds shrinking. Steam hissed around the iron wheels as they vanished down the white horizon, a disappearing mechanical beast, leaving behind nothing but a wooden platform, and a woman who should have been gone with it. Her name was Ida Calhoun, and she didn't move. She just stood there, a statue carved from regret, as snowflakes caught in the deep furrows of her brow and clung to the damp hem of her faded gray cloak. Her boots, cracked and worn at the toes, were already being dusted in white, as though the land itself was trying to erase her, to paint over her presence, until she was just another part of the bleak, forgotten landscape. One gloved hand rested on the hard, swollen curve of her belly, a life sentence and a miracle all at once. The other hand clenched a small, time-worn suitcase, the kind that held more memories than clothes, wrapped tight with a piece of frayed twine. A bitter whisper of wind tugged at the loose strands of her silver-streaked hair, pulling them free from her bonnet like escaping thoughts. Behind her, the wooden bench where she'd waited now looked abandoned, too, as if even inanimate objects could feel the sting of rejection and turn their back on you. "Should have stayed on that train," a voice muttered, sharp and brittle as ice. It was Miss Cora Brandt, the stationmaster's wife, peering from inside the depot window. She didn't even bother to close the glass shutter before the gossip slipped out with her breath, forming a little cloud of judgment in the freezing air. "Too old to be carrying a child. It just ain't right. She's near 50, ain't she?" 46, Ida murmured to no one, her own voice sounding like it had been left out in the cold for too long, thin and cracked. The station quieted. The chuffing of the train was gone. The chatter was gone. There were no more footsteps, no more farewells, just the relentless, soft crunch of snowfall thickening around her, and the sharp, biting sting in her ankles from standing still for an hour that felt like a lifetime. Her body pulsed with the sheer physical heaviness of late pregnancy, a constant aching reminder of her condition. But the deeper weight, the one that had settled down between her bones and her memory, was completely invisible. It was the weight of her own son's words. He had put her on that train himself, back in the city that now felt 1,000,000 miles away. He'd bought the ticket, packed her bag, and looked her right in the eye, his gaze as cold and unforgiving as the iron rails. "You understand, Mama," he'd said, his voice clipped and final. "We can't have this. Not at your age. Not with folks watching. It's a disgrace." His wife, a woman whose wedding dress Ida had stitched with her own hands, had simply turned her face away, clutching their own toddler with arms that had once wrapped around Ida in a welcoming hug. The baby inside her wasn't welcome. It was a scandal, a complication, a loose thread in the carefully woven tapestry of their respectable lives, not wanted by them, not wanted by anyone. So they had sent her away, to a place she didn't know, with a one-way ticket and a hollowed-out heart. And now she was here. She wasn't even sure where here was. Just another forgotten stop on the line where people stared, and the snow fell, and every door you looked at seemed to be locked from the inside. The wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound. It was faint at first, muffled by the thick blanket of snow, but steady. Thump, 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 hoofbeats, slow, sure, and getting closer. Ida turned, her body stiff with cold and fear. A tall rider emerged from the swirling curtain of white, a phantom taking shape in the gloom. His horse was a slash of darkness against the pale, unforgiving world. His long coat was lined with thick fur, snow gathering across his broad shoulders like a winter mantle. A single thick braid of black hair trailed down the side of his neck, stark against the pale skin. His face, shadowed under a broad-brimmed hat, revealed high, strong cheekbones and eyes that did not flinch, did not waver when they met hers. Ida's breath caught in her throat, a tiny frozen puff of air. The man was an Apache. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the pride in his posture. He was a man made of the mountains and the plains, a man who belonged to this harsh land in a way she never could. He didn't dismount right away. He just sat there on his horse, looking at her. He looked at her the way one might study a tree that had been struck by lightning. Damaged, yes, scarred, certainly, but somehow miraculously still upright. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment like she'd seen in every other pair of eyes for months. There was just a quiet, profound acknowledgement of survival. Then, without a single word, he swung his leg over the saddle and climbed down. The leather of his chaps creaked under his weight as his tall boots met the icy ground with a soft crunch. He was even taller than she'd thought, a towering figure against the endless white. She clutched her suitcase tighter, the twine digging into her cold fingers. The man still said nothing. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his movements measured and calm. He stopped just short of her worn-out boots. For a long, silent moment he looked down at her swollen belly, not with the fear or disgust she was so used to, but as though it confirmed something he already suspected, a missing piece of a puzzle falling into place. Then, before she could protest, he reached down and picked up her suitcase. She flinched back, a reflex born of pride and fear. "I didn't ask for— You don't have to," he said. His voice was low and guttural, carrying the gravel of riverbeds and the smoke of ancient fires. It was a voice that wasn't used to making small talk. He looked directly into her eyes, and the world seemed to stop spinning. He added, quieter still, his words cutting through the freezing air like a sharpened blade. "You're mine now." Her pulse, which had been hammering against her ribs, suddenly stilled. The words should have terrified her. They were words of possession, of claim. But the way he said them, they held no ownership, no threat. They held something deeper, something ancient and unbreakable, something that felt less like a claim and more like a statement of fact, as undeniable as the falling snow. Ida's jaw trembled, and a single hot tear escaped, freezing instantly on her cheek. "Why?" she whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast silence. "Because you were left," he said simply, as if it were the only reason anyone ever needed. "And I don't leave people behind." Her knees, which had held her up through shame and heartbreak and bitter cold, finally buckled. It wasn't from weakness. It was because his sentence, so simple and so profound, had reached into a hollow part of her she thought had died long ago. It had found the part of her that hadn't been touched by kindness in years, and it pulled. She caught herself on the cold iron of the station post before she could fall completely, her fingers gripping the frozen metal. His hand hovered near her elbow, a warm presence in the cold, but he didn't grasp her. He let her find her own balance. He let her be strong. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice finally steady. "Talone Redhawk." "Apache?" She knew, but she had to ask. He just nodded once. The snow swirled between them like a veil, a curtain slowly lifting on a new and terrifying chapter of her life. "I'm Ida," she said, offering her name like a fragile truce. He gestured with his head toward the waiting horse. It was a big, black creature, standing impossibly still, its breath pluming in the air. I can walk," she said, almost out of habit. Pride had been her only spine for so long, it didn't know how to bend. She was used to being a burden, and she refused to be one now, but Talone just looked at her belly, then back at her face, and his gaze left no room for argument. "You shouldn't." He helped her up onto the horse without asking again, his hands steady and surprisingly warm against her cold arms. Once she was settled in the saddle, her heavy cloak arranged around her, he mounted behind her. He didn't press against her, didn't touch her more than was absolutely necessary. He was just a solid, silent shadow at her back, as steady and immovable as the mountains they were riding towards. The horse turned, leaving the lonely station behind. They rode toward the distant hills, into a white blur where the trees rose like dark, silent sentinels, and the wind seemed to forget how to be cruel. Behind them, the station, Miss Cora's judgmental eyes, and the ghost of the train faded into the ever-falling snow. No one watched them go. They were just two lost souls swallowed by the wilderness. The silence of the trail gave her the space to weep, but she made no sound. Her tears were for her alone, drying in the wind before they could even reach her chin. Talone didn't speak. He didn't offer empty comforts. He let the quiet landscape and the steady rhythm of the horse do the talking for him. An hour passed, then two. The trees thickened, their branches heavy with snow, creating a hushed, cathedral-like canopy above them. Somewhere high overhead, a hawk cried out, its sharp call swallowed by the thick clouds. Ida's muscles ached with a deep, penetrating cold. Her stomach tightened now and then in small, warning pulses, the baby inside her reminding her of its constant, demanding presence. Just as the weak winter light began to bleed from the sky, turning the world a deep, bruised purple, they reached it. A cabin, tucked away against a steep slope of pine trees. It was modest but sturdy, with smoke already trailing from its stone chimney like a welcoming gray finger. He'd left a fire burning. He had been expecting someone. He helped her down from the horse, his hands firm at her waist, but as soon as her feet touched the ground, he let her go, letting her walk herself across the wooden porch. She paused at the door, her heart hammering. What waited for her behind it? A different kind of loneliness? A dangerous kindness? Or just a terrible, irreversible mistake? Talone unlocked the door and pushed it open. A wave of warmth washed over her, and with it, the scent of pine and smoked venison. Inside, a hearth glowed with orange coals, a living, breathing heart in the center of the small room. A beautifully woven blanket hung on one wall, its patterns telling a story she couldn't read. And in the corner, shrouded in shadows, sat a carved wooden cradle. It looked old, used, and was gathering a fine layer of dust. She turned her eyes from it, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. It felt like a bad omen. He placed her suitcase gently near the fire. She unwrapped the damp scarf from her head, her hair, wet from the melted snow, clinging to her cheeks. She felt his gaze flicker toward her, then retreat, respectful and distant. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his attention on the fire. She sat down slowly on the edge of a simple cot, her body sighing into the sudden stillness. Her boots began to steam as the snow melted from them. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, shook as she tried to unfasten the frozen laces. Before she could manage, Talone knelt before her. Without a word, he untied the stiff knots, one at a time, and set her worn boots near the hearth to dry. The simple act of tenderness was so unexpected, it almost broke her. "Why did you help me?" she whispered again, needing to understand. "Because the world doesn't," he said, his back to her. He stood and stepped away, giving her the gift of space. He poured water from a bucket into a black iron kettle and set it on a hook over the fire. After a few minutes, he poured the steaming liquid into a rough clay mug, hand-formed and imperfect, and handed it to her. She sipped. It was simple broth, salted and impossibly hot. It was the first truly warm thing that had passed her lips in days. Her body responded instantly, gratefully, like a dying plant remembering the taste of rain. "I don't know how to repay you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't owe me." She looked at him, at his tall silhouette against the dancing flames. "Then what do I do now?" "Rest," he said. "Let the fire see you." He crossed the room and sat in a heavy chair that looked like it had been carved from a single tree trunk, smoothed by years of use. His silhouette was long, lean, and utterly calm. He closed his eyes, as if the silence was a song he hadn't heard in a long, long while. She closed hers too, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't dream of being chased, of falling, of being rejected. She dreamed of a fire that didn't go out. She dreamed of a man who didn't flinch when she wept. But as she drifted off, a strange, nagging thought surfaced. He'd said he didn't leave people behind. It sounded noble, But another thought followed, cold and sharp. What if he wasn't saving her? What if he was just collecting her? Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the world deeper and deeper. But inside the cabin, something had stopped breaking. And something else, something terrifying and unknown, had just begun. Snow fell through the pines like whispers from the sky, soft, slow, and endlessly steady. The world outside the cabin was hushed, muffled, buried under a thick blanket of white. But within its thick log walls, something unfamiliar was stirring. Ida awoke to the sound of silence. Not the pressing, lonely silence of the train station, but a silence that wrapped around you like a warm wool shawl. She blinked into the golden half-light of morning. The hearth was still crackling, a low, steady pulse of life. A kettle simmered on the hook, sending a faint wisp of steam into the air. Her boots were standing by the fire, completely dry. A heavy woolen blanket, not the one from her cot, had been tucked around her while she slept. And for a fleeting, dangerous moment, she forgot what it felt like to be unwanted. The child within her moved, a gentle, rolling flutter, like the wings of a trapped sparrow brushing against her ribs. She pressed her palm against the hard mound beneath her bodice and exhaled a long, slow breath that was half thanks, half ache. She had thought she would meet this child alone in a cold, unforgiving world. Now she wasn't so sure what to think. Across the room, Talon Redhawk was sanding a piece of wood, his movements silent and focused. The morning light caught the sharp edge of his cheekbone and the thick, dark braid that fell over his shoulder. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since she'd arrived, but his presence had never felt absent. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to stillness, used to waiting for things to bloom without pulling on their roots. "I must look pitiful," she said, the words breaking the comfortable quiet. His hands didn't stop their rhythmic, scraping work. "You look tired." A dry, humorless laugh escaped her. "I've looked tired for 20 years. His hands paused. He finally looked up, his gaze steady, dark, and completely unreadable. "Then maybe it's time someone let you rest." The sentence settled over her like another quilt, warm and heavy. She had to look away, turning her head toward the fire before the hot sting of tears could surface again. She would not cry in front of this man. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice tight. "For last night. For the broth." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and went back to his work. She watched his hands, noticing the object he was shaping. It looked like some kind of spoon, or maybe a ladle. The handle curved like the neck of a swan. It was beautiful in a plain, deliberate way. It was an object made for a purpose. With a deep groan of effort, she pushed herself up from the cot. One hand went to the small of her back, the other braced against the log wall. The cabin swayed faintly in her vision, a momentary wave of dizziness washing over her. And in a heartbeat, he was at her side, his arm offered for support. She took it unwillingly, hating her own weakness, but too dizzy to pretend she didn't need it. "I can help," she said, gesturing vaguely around the small cabin. "With chores." "You already are," he replied, his voice low. "How?" she asked, bewildered. "By being here." That answer silenced her again. It made no sense. How could her presence, a burden to her own family, be a help to this stranger? What did he mean? Before she could ask, the fragile peace of the morning was shattered. A loud, aggressive knock echoed from the door. Talon reacted instantly. He moved in front of her, his shoulders blocking her from view, as if he expected danger to come bursting right through the wood. His entire demeanor had changed. The quiet craftsman was gone, replaced by a fierce protector. He opened the door slowly, just a crack at first. Sheriff Kershaw stood on the porch, his face red from the cold, flanked by the sour-faced Miss Cora Brandt, wrapped in her Sunday shawl and an almost visible cloak of moral disapproval. Behind them, 2 other men from town sat on their horses, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and crude curiosity. They squinted into the dim light of the cabin, trying to get a look at the scandalous old woman. Well now, Talone, this is an unexpected development, the sheriff said, his voice dripping with false concern as he brushed snow from the brim of his hat. We heard there was a woman up here with you, a mature woman. Thought we ought to check on her welfare. She's fine, Talone said, his voice flat and cold. He didn't move from the doorway, blocking their view. But Cora Brandt's sharp eyes slid past his shoulder and fixed on Ida. Her lips curled into a smirk that was a vile combination of contempt and satisfaction. Is she now? She said, her voice loud enough for the men outside to hear. You know the talk in town, Talone. Not fit is what they're saying. She's old enough to be your mother, and carrying another man's child at that? Folks are mighty curious what kind of arrangement this might be. Talone's jaw muscle worked once, a single tight knot of anger, before his expression went still as stone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence he gave them was heavier and more intimidating than any shout could ever be. She is under my roof, he said at last, each word low, even, and sharp as a shard of ice, and in my care. That is the only arrangement you need to know. Well, the sheriff muttered, clearly uncomfortable under Talone's unblinking stare. He adjusted his coat, shifting his weight. Just be aware, this isn't exactly a town that takes kindly to confusion. Cora's gaze flickered to Ida again, her eyes as hard and cold as pebbles. Have you no shame? She spat. The question hit Ida like a physical blow, but then something inside her, something that had been dormant for years, flickered to life. She took a step forward, leaning on the wall for support, and met the older woman's cruel gaze. Her voice was quiet, but for the first time in a long time it didn't shake. I have more shame than I know what to do with, ma'am, Ida said clearly. What I lack is shelter, and for now it seems I have it. Cora Brandt actually blinked, taken aback. The words didn't sting her with anger, they unsettled her. They were a simple, undeniable truth, and they left no room for her petty judgments. They left after a long, awkward pause, their disapproving footsteps vanishing into the fresh snowfall. Talone closed the door, the sound final and firm, and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. He stood with his back to her for a moment, his shoulders tense. I'm sorry, Ida said, her voice small. I didn't mean to cause you trouble. You didn't, he replied, turning to face her. His eyes were dark, intense. They did. But as he looked at her, a new, chilling thought entered her mind. The sheriff hadn't seemed concerned. He'd seemed angry, and his warning about confusion felt less like advice and more like a threat. It wasn't just about morality. It was about something else, something to do with Talone. Later that night, as Ida sat by the fire, she noticed something she hadn't before. Tucked away under the edge of her cot, almost completely hidden, was a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was a journal. It wasn't dusty. It had been placed there recently. Her heart began to pound. Was it his? Was he leaving it for her to read? With trembling hands, she reached down and picked it up. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. It wasn't his. The first entry was dated 2 years ago. My dearest Anya, it began. It was a gift. She flipped through the pages, filled with notes about herbs, sketches of flowers, and observations about the changing seasons. It was the journal of Talone's dead wife. Ida knew she shouldn't. It was a violation of the deepest kind. But she couldn't stop herself. She turned to the last few pages. The handwriting grew frantic, shaky. The last entry, dated just before the first deep snow of that winter 2 years ago, made the blood in her veins run cold. It read, Sheriff Kershaw was here again. He says the town won't stand for it. He says this land holds a debt that must be paid. He warned me to take the baby and run, to leave Talone before the winter comes. He says my husband is a dangerous man, that what he's protecting under this house will get us all killed. I don't know who to believe. Talone says the sheriff is the one who lies, that he wants what is ours. Ida's hand flew to her mouth. She read the final, terrifying line, her eyes wide with horror. "There is something buried under the hearth. Talona says it will keep us safe, but I am so afraid. If I die and the baby with me, do not let them say it was the winter. It will be his fault. But whose fault? Talone's or the sheriff's?" Ida looked from the journal in her hands to the silent man across the room, his face illuminated by the dancing firelight. The fire that was burning directly over the hearth. The man who had saved her. Was he a savior, or was he a killer? The cabin walls creaked softly in the late afternoon chill, the old logs expanding and contracting like the chest of some great sleeping beast. Smoke from the chimney curled upward into the winter sky, a fragile signal of life in a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. Inside, a terrible silence had fallen. It was thicker than the log walls, heavier than the snow on the roof. Ida sat on the edge of the cot, the leather-bound journal clutched in her hands like a piece of damning evidence. The fire in the hearth, which had seemed so welcoming just hours before, now looked menacing. What was under there? What secret was buried beneath those stones, a secret worth dying for? Across the room, Talon sharpened a long hunting blade, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on whetstone grating on Ida's raw nerves. He hadn't said a word, but he knew. He knew she had found the journal. He knew the questions were screaming in her mind. He was just waiting. The shame came in waves, uninvited and suffocating. Not the old shame, the shame of her age or her pregnancy. This was a new shame, the shame of a fool. Had she walked willingly into a monster's den? Had she traded one kind of prison for another, far more dangerous one? Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from pure, unadulterated fear. She thought of his words at the station. "You're mine now." They had sounded like a promise then. Now they sounded like a death sentence. "Her name was Anya?" Ida finally asked, her voice a dry whisper. The sound of steel on stone stopped. Talon laid the knife down carefully on the mantelpiece. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were not angry. They were filled with a grief so profound, it was like looking into a bottomless canyon. "Yes," he said. "This journal—" She held it up. "It says you have something buried. Something the sheriff wanted. It says if she died, it would be your fault." The words came out in a rush, a torrent of accusation and terror. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He just rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked over to the hearth. He knelt down, his back to her, and stared into the flames. "There are truths in that book," he said, his voice low and rough. "And there are lies. The sheriff is good at twisting them together." He reached out and placed a hand on the warm stones of the hearth. "What's buried here is not a body. It's not a sin. It's a legacy." Ida watched him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "My great-grandfather was a leader of our people," Talon began, his voice taking on the quality of a story told 1,000 times. "When the soldiers came, when they were driving us from our lands, he knew he could not save everyone, but he could save our future. He gathered the gold of our tribe, not trinkets, but sacred objects, ceremonial pieces, the physical memory of our people, and he buried it here, on this land that was blessed, where the spirits are strong. He passed the knowledge of its location down to his son, and he to his. It was never to be spent. It was to be protected, a promise that we would endure." He paused, the only sound the crackle of the burning logs. "Sheriff Kershaw's grandfather was one of the soldiers who drove my people out. He was a greedy man. He suspected what was hidden here, and he tried to take it. There was a fight. My grandfather defended our legacy. And Kershaw's grandfather, he did not survive." Ida gasped. "The Kershaws have considered that gold theirs ever since," Talon continued, his voice laced with a cold, ancient anger. "A right of vengeance, they call it. The sheriff has been trying to run me off this land since the day I came back to claim it. He spreads poison in the town. He tells them I'm dangerous. He tells them I'm a savage living on land that isn't mine." He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to match the one in the hearth. He whispered those same poisons into my wife's ear. He made her doubt me. He made her afraid. So her death? Ida whispered, horrified. Was it really an accident? Talon's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. She was due in the winter. The midwife from the reservation was supposed to come, but her wagon broke down, a strap cut clean through. Anya went into labor during a blizzard. I was out hunting, trying to get meat before the worst of the storm hit. When I got back, it was too late. The cold took her. And our son. He looked away, his jaw tight. Kershaw called it a tragedy, an accident. But I found the cut wagon strap later. It was no accident. He made sure she would be alone. He wanted the storm to kill her. He wanted me to be broken, to give up and leave so he could finally tear this house apart and take what he believes is his. The truth of it settled over Ida, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. It wasn't about morality. It wasn't about shame. It was about gold and murder. She stood up, the journal falling from her lap. She looked at this man, this quiet, grieving man, and saw not a monster, but a guardian. A man chained to a terrible legacy, haunted by a grief she couldn't possibly imagine. And at that exact moment, as the terrible truth hung in the air between them, they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. It was too soon for the sheriff to return, too early for more trouble. Talone moved to the window, peering out into the gray afternoon. His body went rigid. "No," he breathed. Ida rushed to his side, her own fear momentarily forgotten. A rickety buckboard wagon was pulling up to the cabin, and driving it was a man she recognized with a sickening jolt. It was her son, David. But he wasn't there to apologize. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that dwarfed her own. He stumbled from the wagon and ran toward the cabin door, his movements frantic. "Mama!" he cried, his voice breaking. "Mama, you have to hide! They're coming for you!" Talone threw the door open. David practically fell inside, his gaze darting from his mother to the imposing Apache man beside her. "What are you talking about? Who is coming?" Ida demanded, grabbing her son's arm. David was trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The baby's father," he choked out. "It wasn't just some affair, Mama. It was my boss, Alistair Finch." Ida stared at him, uncomprehending. Alistair Finch was one of the wealthiest, most powerful timber barons in the state. A ruthless man with a reputation for crushing anyone who got in his way. He died, Mama," David stammered. "A heart attack 2 months ago, and his family, his sons, they're animals. They found out about you. They think you're coming for a piece of the inheritance. They think the baby is a threat to their fortune." He finally looked his mother in the eye, his own filled with shame and fear. "That's why I sent you away. I was trying to protect you, to hide you. They threatened my wife, my son. They said they would hire men to find you and solve the problem. Permanently." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the final devastating piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Those men are on their way here now," he whispered, his face ashen. "I overheard them. They found out where you were, and the man they hired to lead them, the local man who knows the territory. It's Sheriff Kershaw." The world tilted on its axis. Ida stumbled back, her hand flying to her belly. The baby. This innocent, unborn child was an heir to a fortune, and because of it, she had a target on her back. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The sheriff wasn't just after the gold under the hearth. He was being paid to get rid of her and the baby. 2 problems, 1 remote cabin. He was using the town's petty prejudice, their fear of Talone, as the perfect cover for a cold-blooded execution. He could kill them all, blame it on the savage Apache, and walk away with a pocket full of blood money and a claim to a hidden treasure. They weren't just outcasts, they were prey, and the hunters were closing in. Just then, a new figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, walking calmly out of the pines as if she were merely out for a stroll. It was an older Apache woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her long gray hair in 2 braids. She was draped in a shawl of intricate beads that told a story of their own. Nahaima, Talone breathed, a mixture of relief and dread in his voice. My aunt. The woman, Nahaima, didn't seem surprised by the scene of chaos in the cabin. Her eyes, as bright and sharp as a hawk's, took in everything at once. Ida's terrified face, her swollen belly, her trembling son, and the grim understanding on her nephew's face. She wasn't just a midwife arriving for a birth. She was a warrior arriving for a battle. She stepped onto the porch, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. They are coming, she said, her voice calm and steady. The storm brings them. She looked up at the sky, where the clouds were gathering thick and fast, a bruised, angry purple. And they will be here by nightfall. The storm broke over the land not with a warning, but with a roar. The wind howled through the pines like a ravenous wolf, tearing at the branches, and snow began to fall not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The world outside the cabin vanished into a swirling vortex of white fury. The roof shuddered. The old logs groaned. It was as if the sky itself was trying to tear the little cabin from the earth. And in the heart of that raging tempest, Ida's water broke. It started as a low, insistent pressure, a tightening deep within her that she had never felt before. Then it surged into a wave of pain so sudden and so sharp that she doubled over with a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her belly. Now, David choked out, his face pale with a new kind of terror. It's happening now? Talone moved faster than Ida had ever seen him. The quiet, grieving man was gone, replaced by a commander in the heat of battle. He caught Ida before she fell, his arms strong and steady, and half carried her to the cot. Nahaima, he called, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. The old woman was already there. She laid Ada down on the bed, covering her with the heavy, hand-stitched quilt that had seen so much life and death. Her movements were calm, efficient, and ageless. She was a force of nature as powerful as the storm outside. Breathe, daughter, Nahaima murmured, her voice a low, soothing chant. The baby knows the way. You just open the door. While Nahaima tended to Ada, Talone and David became a whirlwind of desperate activity. The windows! Talone ordered, his voice sharp. Barricade them! Use the table! Anything! He himself began feeding dry logs into the hearth, stoking the fire until it blazed with a fierce, defiant light, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Sweat beaded on his brow, a stark contrast to the freezing gale rattling the cabin. Nahaima worked by the firelight, her hands moving with an ancient wisdom. She whispered songs in a language older than English, songs of strength and creation. She pressed warm, damp cloths to Ida's lower back and placed bitter-tasting herbs under her tongue that were meant to ease the pain, but did little to stop the relentless, crushing waves. The pain was an ocean, and Ida was drowning in it. It came in surges, some sharp as 1,000 needles, others a deep, rolling agony that seemed to tear her body in two. She gritted her teeth, her knuckles white as she clutched the wooden bedpost. A scream ripped from her throat as a contraction seized her, stealing her breath, her sanity, her will to fight. I can't! She choked out, her hair plastered to her temples with sweat. I'm too old for this. I waited too long. The old shame, the old fear, it was all coming back, trying to poison this sacred, terrifying moment. Talone was suddenly kneeling beside her. He reached out and took her hand. His grip wasn't tight or forceful. It was just there, a silent anchor in the raging storm of her body. She opened her eyes and looked into his face, illuminated by the roaring fire. She saw no fear, no pity. She saw only presence. She saw the fire of the hearth reflected in his dark, steady eyes. You are not too late, he said, his voice a low rumble against the shrieking wind. She waited for you. For this moment, you are strong enough. Another contraction surged through her, bigger than all the rest, and this time, Ida screamed again, but it was not a scream of pain. It was a scream of release, a primal roar that carried with it all the grief, all the shame, all the years of being told she was worthless. It was the sound of a woman breaking free. The wind rattled the window shutters, a furious, desperate pounding as if the world outside demanded to know if she would survive this, if she dared to bring new life into a world so determined to end hers. And then, just past midnight, as the storm reached its zenith, a new cry split the air. It wasn't hers. It was the baby's, a sharp, wet, furious sound, a cry not of weakness, but of indignant life. Ida collapsed back onto the sweat-soaked pillows, tears of exhaustion and overwhelming relief already falling, mingling with the sweat on her cheeks. Nahaima, with a soft smile, wrapped the tiny, squirming child in a clean piece of linen and brought her to Ida's side. "She is here," the old woman whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "She came through the snow and the fire. She is a storm daughter." With trembling hands, Ida took her baby. She was overwhelmed, a tidal wave of love and terror and disbelief washing over her. The girl's eyes were squeezed shut, her face red and wrinkled, her impossibly tiny fingers curled into fists. Her furious cry softened into a series of hiccuped breaths as Ida pressed her to her chest. She had a daughter, and she wept, silent, body-shaking sobs of a joy so fierce it was painful. Talone stood back, giving them their moment, a silent, watchful guardian. But Ada, without looking away from her daughter's face, reached out her free hand. He took it without hesitation, his large, calloused palm enclosing hers. She held their daughter in one arm and his hand in her other, and in that moment, the raging storm inside her finally quieted. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a scandal, not as a mistake, but as a woman who had borne both grief and grace and had lived to tell the tale. But the other storm, the one with men and guns, was not over. Suddenly a sound cut through the howl of the wind, the splintering of wood. It came from the front door. David, who had been watching the window, spun around, his eyes wide with horror. "They're here!" Talone released her hand, his face transforming into a cold, hard mask of fury. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its tip still glowing a dull red. "Stay with her," he commanded David. Crack! An axe blade burst through the thick wood of the door, just inches from the bolt. Shards of wood exploded into the room. A raw, chilling voice bellowed from outside, barely audible over the wind. "Kershaw! Open this door, Talone. We know you're in there. Give us the woman and the brat and we'll let you live." It was the sheriff, the lawman, the murderer. Ida clutched her newborn daughter tighter, her heart seizing with a terror that was colder than any winter wind. The flimsy wooden door was all that stood between her new, fragile family and a pack of ruthless killers. The battle for the gold, for the inheritance, for their very lives, was about to begin, and the firelight glinted off the long, sharp edge of the axe blade that was hacking its way into their home. The cabin door shuddered, then burst inward with a deafening crash, ripped from its leather hinges. A blast of snow and wind roared into the room, extinguishing half the candles and sending embers scattering from the hearth. Framed in the doorway, like demons emerging from a frozen hell, stood Sheriff Kershaw and two other men, their faces obscured by scarves, their long coats dusted with snow, their eyes glinting with a greedy, murderous light. "Well now," Kershaw snarled, his voice a low growl that barely rose above the storm. He held a pistol, its dark metal seeming to absorb the light from the room. "Looks like we're just in time for the christening." Talone didn't wait. He moved like a shadow, a blur of motion. Before the second man could even raise his rifle, Talone lunged, not with the glowing poker, but with his bare hands. He slammed the man against the doorframe with a sickening crunch, grabbing the rifle and bringing the stock up hard under his chin. The man collapsed into the snow outside without a sound. David, fueled by a desperate paternal courage Ida had never seen in him, let out a raw cry and charged the third man, tackling him around the waist. They crashed into the heavy wooden table, sending mugs and plates scattering across the floorboards. The man's pistol went off, the shot deafening in the small cabin, the bullet tearing a hot furrow through the log wall just inches above Ida's head. Ida screamed, instinctively curling her body around the tiny wailing infant in her arms. This was it. This was the end. A dirty, violent death in a forgotten cabin at the edge of the world. But Nahaima was a rock. She stood between Ida and the fight, her small body radiating a fury that was more intimidating than any weapon. "You will not touch this child," she hissed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This child is protected by spirits you cannot comprehend, you filthy grave robbers." Kershaw just laughed, a sound as ugly and broken as the door. "Spirits don't stop lead, old woman." He leveled his pistol, not at Talon, who was now wresting the rifle from the second man, but directly at Nahaima. "No!" Talon roared. But before he could move, a shape hurtled past him from the corner of the room. It was Ida's suitcase. David, having knocked his opponent senseless against the floor, had grabbed the only weapon he could find and thrown it with all his might. The small, heavy case caught Kershaw square in the side of the head. It wasn't enough to knock him down, but it was enough to make him stagger, his shot going wild, shattering the small window above the wash basin. The distraction was all Talon needed. He brought the captured rifle around like a club, a swift, brutal arc that connected with Kershaw's gun hand. There was a sharp crack of bone, and the pistol clattered to the floor. The sheriff screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and rage clutching his shattered wrist. He was disarmed, but he wasn't beaten. His eyes, burning with a mad fire, locked on Ida, on the bundle in her arms. "The gold," he spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "The gold and the girl. They're both mine." He lunged, his good hand reaching, his fingers curled into a claw, aiming for the baby. Ida scrambled backward on the cot, a strangled cry in her throat. She was trapped. There was nowhere to go. And then, a new figure appeared in the broken doorway. It was Miss Cora Brandt. Her face was white as a sheet, her hair a wild mess, her fine Sunday shawl torn and covered in snow. She must have followed them. She must have seen them ride out with rifles, her gossip's curiosity finally overpowered by a dawning, horrifying suspicion. She stood there, panting, taking in the scene of carnage, the broken door, the unconscious men, the bleeding sheriff. Her eyes landed on Kershaw, on his face twisted with greed and madness as he lunged for a newborn child. And in that instant, something inside the cold, judgmental woman finally broke. "He's a murderer!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, piercing cry that cut through the storm. "He did it! He killed Talon's wife! I heard him bragging about it to the men, about the cut wagon strap. He said the winter would take the credit." Kershaw froze, his head snapping toward her. His face, for the first time, showed not anger, but pure, animal panic. The diversion lasted only a second, but it was a lifetime. Talon was on him. He didn't hit him. He didn't shoot him. He grabbed the front of the sheriff's coat and dragged him, kicking and screaming, out of the cabin and into the heart of the raging blizzard. He threw the lawman face first into a deep snowbank. Kershaw came up sputtering, his face a mask of snow and terror. "You can't," he gasped. "You'll hang for this. I'm the law." Talon stood over him, a towering figure of righteous fury against the swirling white. The rifle was still in his hand, but he let it hang at his side. "You are not the law," he said, his voice a low, final judgment. "You are just a thief and a killer." He looked around at the wild, unforgiving landscape, at the roaring wind and the biting snow. "This land remembers what you did. It remembers my wife. It remembers my son." He turned his back on the sputtering, broken man and walked back toward the warm, flickering light of the cabin. "The land will be your judge," he said, and closed the shattered door on Kershaw's terrified screams, leaving him to the mercy of the storm he had intended to use as his accomplice. Inside the cabin, a stunned silence fell. The wind still howled, but the violence was over. David, bruised and breathing heavily, leaned against the wall. Nahaima was calmly lighting the candles that had blown out. And Cora Brandt stood in the doorway, trembling, weeping, her face a ruin of shame and newfound courage. Ida looked down at the child in her arms, who had miraculously slept through the final, terrible moments. She smoothed the baby's fine, dark hair, her own tears falling onto the warm blanket. She looked up at Talon as he bolted the broken door as best he could. Their eyes met across the small, wrecked room. They had survived. They had fought together. They had won. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if the sheriff would live or die, if the Finch family would send more men, or if the town would ever accept them. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She looked from Talone, her fierce protector, to David, her son who had finally found his courage, to Nahaima, her spirit guide, to Cora, her unlikely savior. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer alone. This strange, broken, and beautiful collection of people was her family. Talone crossed the room and knelt before her. He gently pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. He wasn't looking at her as a burden or a responsibility. He was looking at her as an equal, as his partner. "The storm is passing," he said softly. Ida looked down at her daughter, a tiny, perfect life born of chaos and courage. She was a child of the storm, a child of fire and snow. "What will we name her?" Ida whispered. Talone smiled, a true, warm smile that transformed his face. It was the first time she had ever seen it. "She already has a name," he said. "Her name is Hope." The snow had begun to soften. It melted not in a sudden torrent, but in slow, deliberate drops that fell from the edge of the newly repaired roof, from the greening tips of the pine branches, from the grooves of boot prints that had long since faded. Winter was no longer a cruel tyrant. It had surrendered to something gentler, something filled with the damp, earthy promise of spring. Ida stood on the cabin porch, her daughter swaddled warm and snug against her chest in a woven sling Talone had made. The baby, now 3 months old, cooed and sighed in her sleep, a breathy, contented sound that seemed to change the very shape of the world. Ida swayed gently, her hand resting on her daughter's back, her fingers curled around the tiny, living miracle she had been told she was a disgrace for wanting, a fool for keeping. Behind her, the cabin door opened. Talon emerged, his face calm, but his eyes holding a familiar fire. He held a stack of letters in one hand, and in the other, a freshly carved wooden rattle for the baby. News had reached them, as it always did. Slow, uncertain, and wrapped in the town's lingering judgment. "They've written again," he said, his voice low. "The new town council. 3 of the elders signed it. They're still calling our family immoral. They want the circuit judge to intervene when he passes through next month." One of the names on the petition, he didn't have to tell her, was Cora Brandt's replacement, a man who believed Kershaw had simply gotten lost in the storm. The lie was easier for the town to live with than the truth. But Ida's shoulders did not slump. They didn't tighten either. She simply stood straighter, rocking her child. The fear was gone, burned out of her in the fire and fury of that winter's night. "Let them," she said, her voice clear and steady as a river stone. "Let them speak to their own shame, not to mine." She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. A new resolve, forged in the hearth of their shared battle, had taken root in her soul. "We'll go to town," she said, "not to ask permission, not to beg for acceptance. We will go because I will not teach my daughter how to hide." He met her gaze, his dark eyes full of a fierce, protective pride. A slow smile touched his lips. "Then we will go together." The ride into town was slow and deliberate. They traveled in the same rickety wagon David had arrived in, the one Talone had spent weeks repairing, reinforcing the wheels, oiling the axles until the old spokes hummed softly with every rotation. Nahaima stayed behind, tending the hearth, a silent, powerful sentinel of the home they had defended with their lives. The baby Hope slept soundly on Ida's lap, wrapped in the same hand-stitched quilt she'd been born in. By the time they arrived, spring had fully reached the edges of the town's main dirt road, coaxing brave green shoots from the once frozen ground. The townsfolk were out, clustered near the general store and the church, their voices hushing as the wagon approached, their eyes sharpening with a mixture of fear, resentment, and a grudging, unspoken respect. The new sheriff, a young man with nervous eyes, stood on the steps of his office, arms folded, watching them come. Taloni pulled the wagon to a halt right in the center of town. He got down first, then turned and helped Eda down. She wore her best dress, not new, certainly not without a few frayed edges, but clean and stitched with a quiet pride. Her silver-streaked hair was swept up, glinting in the bright spring sunlight like threads of frost that refused to melt away. Taloni stood beside her, tall and calm as a mountain, dressed in simple, clean buckskin, his long braid tied back, his expression unreadable and profoundly intimidating. They didn't walk toward the store. They walked toward the crowd. Whispers rose like heat off the dirt. Look at her, flaunting it. And him, acting like he owns the place. It still ain't right. The baby stirred at the noise, and Eda gently hushed her, her touch firm and confident. She walked directly toward the wooden steps of the church, where the town's most vocal critics, including the new councilman, stood waiting. "You've made your point, Mrs. Calhoun," the councilman said, his voice loud for the benefit of the crowd. "But this is a decent town. This situation is not the sort of thing we can condone." "No," Ada replied, her voice calm and carrying, reaching every ear in the silent square. "You are not a decent town. You are a town of fear." The man blinked, sputtering. "I beg your pardon?" "You fear change," Eda continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You fear a woman who lives without asking for your permission. You fear a man who protects his family without needing your approval. You fear anything and anyone that doesn't fit neatly into the small, sad story you tell yourselves about how the world is supposed to be." Talon stepped forward then, not looming, but simply taking his place beside her. His presence was a silent, unshakable fact. "This is my wife," he said, his voice resonating with a power that needed no volume. "This is my daughter. They are my family. They carry my name. Speak against them again, and you speak against me." A hush fell over the crowd. The blacksmith, a large man named Silas Dade, cleared his throat and took a half-step forward. "He's right," he grumbled, looking not at Eda, but at the councilman. "It ain't none of our damn business what their family looks like. They ain't hurting no one. They ain't stealing. Let them live their lives." A few people in the crowd nodded. Others just looked away, their faces flushed with a long, overdue embarrassment. The councilman opened his mouth, then closed it again, no words coming out. The power had shifted. The fear was no longer theirs. It was the town's. Eda exhaled, a breath she felt she'd been holding her entire life. She turned, her heart thundering not from fear, but from a profound, liberating release, and walked back toward the wagon. Talon helped her climb back in. She settled the baby in her lap, then turned to him, her eyes shining. "I don't know what that was," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "but it felt like coming all the way back from the dead." Talon reached out and took her hand, his touch slow, deliberate, and full of a world of unspoken emotion. "It was fire," he said, his voice soft. "The fire beneath the snow. It's yours now." Back at the cabin, as the spring dusk melted into a sky filled with 1,000 brilliant stars, Talone laid a small, simple ring on the windowsill. It wasn't gold or silver. It was a single, smooth band carved from elk bone, polished until it shone, wrapped in a delicate strip of red-dyed hide. "I don't need vows witnessed by strangers," he said, his back to her as he looked out at the dark silhouette of the pines. "But I need you here, with me, as long as the trees stand." Eda picked up the ring, its surface smooth and warm against her fingers. The baby slept peacefully in the cradle nearby, the carved hawk on its rail seeming to watch over her. With a trembling hand, Eda slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Then I will stand beside you," she answered, her voice low and certain. In the quiet that followed, nothing more needed to be said. Outside, the last patches of snow had all but vanished, revealing the dark, damp earth, rich with the promise of new growth. And for the first time in more years than she could count, Ida Calhoun, now Ida Redhawk, allowed herself to believe something she had never before dared to even think. She wasn't just surviving. She wasn't just enduring. She was home. She was wanted. And she was and had always been more than enough. So if you've ever felt like the world has told you it's too late, if your age or your scars or the choices you've made feel louder than your own worth, remember the story of Ada. Remember the woman left for dead in the snow and the fire she found buried deep beneath it. Remember the quiet man who offered not pity but strength, and the family they forged not from blood but from courage. Sometimes, the greatest love stories don't arrive with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes they arrive as quiet as snowfall and end up burning brighter and warmer than any fire. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of survival, hope, and the incredible strength of the human heart.